So, welcome to our briefing today about PhDs, where we'll be answering all of your questions. My name's Lucy, and I'm one of the careers advisors here at the Careers Service.
And I'm Tim Wheel. I'm a member of the zoology department, and I'm a fellow at Pembroke College. And as you might be able to tell, I did my PhD in the US, but I've been heavily involved in selections in the UK and in Europe before.
So today we're going to talk a bit about factors to consider when thinking about doing a PhD and talking about where you might find opportunities. We'll also talk a bit about what makes a good candidate and top tips for applications both in the UK, the US and elsewhere as well. We'll talk a bit about dealing with specific circumstances and also how to make the most of your references, which you'll be asked for all PhD programmes and opportunities. So hopefully you'll have all of your key questions answered by the end of this briefing today. So we're going to start off with thinking about what you should consider when you're thinking about a PhD. And the first sort of key area to think about is actually your own motivation for wanting to do a PhD in the first place. It's really good to think about what you want to get out of it. A PhD is a big time investment in particular. It can last for 4 years, potentially longer. But also it can potentially be a big financial investment as well. So you need to be really motivated to get the most out of that opportunity, because it will be a real challenge if your heart's not really in it. And as a careers advisor, our advice is always to say, don't do a PhD because you aren't sure what else to do, because it is a big commitment and there is a lot to think about if you are going to do a PhD. Tim, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, we always say this shouldn't be the default. You might feel like you're enjoying your time at university, you enjoy the atmosphere, maybe you'd like to stay in Cambridge, but signing up for a 3 or 4 year PhD can really be a challenge, and it's something you want to go into because you're excited about the topic and about doing research, not necessarily just because you want to stay in one place. It is very different than undergraduate, and it is very different than the research you've been undertaking and the dissertation you've been writing as a final year student. It's going to be difficult. It's a real joy, but you really do want to have a clear mind and a good bit of thinking before you go in.
Good. So ask yourself the questions that are on here when you're thinking about doing a PhD. So think about why you want to do it and what you want to get out of it, but also think about your research interests as well. What are they and where have they come from? And also consider how a PhD might fit with your longer term career aims. And then once you've answered those questions and come to that decision that a PhD is the right choice for you, then you might be thinking about, okay, well, how can I pick the right PhD opportunity or program that will best fit with me? And realistically, when choosing a PhD, it does all come down to finding the right fit for you. So Tim, have you got any advice for that?
Absolutely. It's going to be critical to find what's best for you. And you really are unique, not only in your interests, but also in maybe the types of things you like to do, where you like to be. Do you want to be in a city or somewhere rural? Do you want to be in the north or the south or the east or the west of a country? Do you want to be in Asia? Do you want to be in South America? So you need to sit down and have a think. It's not what your friends want to do. It's not what your advisor thinks you should do. The other thing is, with your research topic, you might not have been exposed to all the different aspects of your subject yet. In Cambridge, you'll often have to narrow down quite rapidly. And so you might want to consider a program where you do have the option to do, in the sciences, what we call rotations, where you might be able to taste a couple of different labs. And that can really be a benefit to just exposing you to what's out there. The other thing just to mention is, when you are looking for a supervisor, this person will have a really major part in your life and in your education. So you want to find a supervisor that's going to work for and with you. So the questions of, do you want someone who's going to be hands-on or hands-off? Do you want someone who's going to always be around and in their office and in the lab? Or would you prefer someone who's going to be a little more distant? Would you be working with that supervisor, or would you be working with a postdoc or another graduate student? Now, these are the types of questions you really want to consider before you go into something like this. And the way, at least I always advise, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, is make sure that you're asking the people from this research group. Make sure you're talking to the people from the institution. If you're thinking about going to, a research lab somewhere, maybe it's off campus and it's in a distant area away from the university, talk to the people who are there. Do they like it? Do they enjoy it? Is it productive? Really try to gather as much data as you can, not only about the institution or about the department, but also about the group. Ask if people publish in that group. Ask how often you see the supervisor. Ask what the supervisor looks like when they're mad and they're stressed. These can be really powerful questions that I think it's really important to ask.
Yeah, and it's really great to get that honest feedback from other people in the lab, not just talking to a potential supervisor as well. Other PhD students or postdocs can really give you that insight into what the day-to-day life is like before you start that PhD, so you can go into it having made a really informed decision.
And if there's no one there to ask, just, you should ask the advisor or the supervisor, can you have an email? Could you Skype somebody? Can you FaceTime someone? Because you really want to know what it's actually like.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important not just to consider your research topic and what's going to keep you interested and motivated on that project for the time that you're going to be doing it, but also who you're going to be working with, the actual group itself, but also some practical stuff like actually which country do you want to be in, which area of the country. PhDs do vary from country to country in terms of length, and how long it will take, how much teaching is actually involved and whether there are teaching elements as part of the programme, and also the style of examination. So you may find that the style of PhD suits you better, for example, in the US rather than the UK as well. And do be mindful of entry requirements. So, for example, in Europe, it's quite common to need a master's, often meaning a standalone master's qualification rather than an MSci as part of an integrated master's programme. And do think about where you want to live in the long term, because that might influence the options that are available to you in terms of institutions, choice of PhD, and the kinds of places that you might be able to work. And do think about whether you'd be happy and able to work well living in that place for several years, and think about whether it's a good fit for you. And Tim, have you got any advice on that?
I went to an interview at NYU in New York City, and they told us that you could go from your room to the lab without ever having to go outside. And this was considered to be a real positive of working at this institution. And it dawned on me very quickly that not going outside was not something I was willing to give up. So those are, living in Manhattan could be amazing, or living in London might be great for some people, but for other people, they may prefer, a different atmosphere. So it really is important to visit the place and see it, and, walk the streets and imagine living in Leeds or living in Paris, or, living in San Francisco. And, you'll very quickly see if it's going to work for you.
And the other thing to consider is your support for career progression. So if you're thinking about undertaking a PhD with a view to a career outside of academia, you might want to consider whether you can establish links with industry during your PhD, whether there will be opportunities to develop the skills that are in demand in industry, but also more generally, will you be able to engage in activities within the university to support your ambitions? So if you're thinking about something like science communication or moving into another area, will there be opportunities alongside your PhD to support you with that? But equally, if you're thinking about taking your PhD into a career in academia, there may be other factors that you might want to consider there. So Tim, do you want to weigh in?
Just want to echo that. That's great advice. And it really is important to ask those questions early on. Because if you're thinking about your career, then your supervisor will be thinking about your career. Sometimes if you're not thinking about your career, you might end up waiting to later on in the process, and it becomes more challenging.
So realistically, when thinking about a PhD, it all boils down to finding the right fit for you and the right opportunity that's going to enable you to get the best out of your PhD. And with that in mind, this seems a good time to talk about some of the different types of PhDs, because there's lots of acronyms out there, and not all PhDs are the same. It can be difficult to know how they differ and what you might get out of some of those options. So one area that has grown quite considerably over the recent sort of time are the doctoral training partnerships, which are partnerships between university research groups, and that can sometimes be across more than one institution, and research councils or funding bodies. Usually in the doctoral training partnerships, or DTPs as they're known, students will undertake a period of training, including those lab rotations, during their first year before focusing more specifically on their PhD research project. One of the factors to consider with DTPs is that often the research projects that are available will be related to the research priorities of the funding body or the research council, and students will usually apply it initially for a theme or area that they're interested in before specialising at the end of that first year. Quite a few of the DTPs now are requiring students that undertake an internship as part of the programme, and that will usually be in something completely different to their research area, and for around 3 months as a minimum. The BBSRC DTPs are including this in their programme, and it seems that others may be following suit. So are there any other key points to consider with the DTP program?
Yeah, it's just good to talk to the people who've been in the program. How is it as a cohort? Are you supported as a group? Or do you just sort of become absorbed within the department? And the programs that do offer these other aspects, I mean, it really is beneficial. The reality is many of us, or many students who go into PhDs will do something else in their career, especially when you consider the length of your career. And having the chance to go into industry, or having the chance to go into a school, or to go into an outreach group or an NGO is really valuable experience. And that's why it's become an integrated part of many of the doctoral training programs. The other thing to look at is there's lots of programs in all parts of the country within the UK. So it is worth sort of going and exploring. There's some really strong programs in many different places. So don't necessarily just limit your choice to London, Cambridge, and Oxford, for example. Really look all over, because there's some really strong work being done in all parts of the country.
Absolutely. And one of the benefits of the DTPs that work across a number of institutions is that if you're interested in something that's perhaps more interdisciplinary, or there's research expertise in more than one of those institutions, that can give you the opportunity to work with a number of different supervisors and just expand your horizons a little bit in terms of your experience that you may gain.
And many of them will have rotations where you do 2 or 3 months in different labs. And that also gives you the chance, even if you know what you want to do, to start to build possible collaborations and to get to talk to other people. And that's really quite enriching and useful for your science as well as for your career.
Good. You'll also find a number of programs now run through other institutes. We've got some examples on the slides of the Wellcome Trust, Francis Crick, Cancer Research UK, and there's a number of others that are out there. And again, similar to the DTPs, these will often involve a tour or training element with rotations before focusing on a specific research project. And some of these are 1+3 programs where you would achieve an MRes qualification in the first year before progressing into the PhD program. There's also what you may see when you're looking at advertised PhDs, case and iCase studentships. So case studentships see research being undertaken in collaboration between an academic department and partner organisations, usually industry. iCase studentships are very similar, but the businesses take the lead in arranging those partnerships with academics, which then give researchers access to the training facilities and expertise that aren't available in the academic setting alone. With both of these, the key component really is the opportunity to work collaboratively with an industry partner. And if you do undertake a PhD as part of a case studentship, you would spend a minimum of 3 months on placement with the collaborating company. So at the University of Cambridge, you'll often see case studentships with AstraZeneca, but lots of other opportunities and partnerships do exist for those. And finally, the other option is to go straight into a specific PhD project where you will have a defined project with your supervisor, and you'll go straight into conducting your PhD research right from the beginning. Often there might not be a formal training program or the lab rotations or internships for these opportunities, but they're great if you're really clear about the research that you want to do, and you're really happy with the supervisor and you recognise that that's a great fit, and you're the sort of person that's ready to dive straight in and ready to crack on with your research. Tim, have you got any advice for that?
Yeah, if you're going to do that, just make sure you know the supervisor. Most students will have spent a little bit of time in that lab, either over the summer or in their undergraduate time, or worked with them a bit. If you are just jumping into a situation that you maybe don't have as much information on, you just want to make sure it's going to work for you. And that means visiting, that means taking a bit of time, because it's a serious commitment, 3 to 4 years.
Good. And Tim, would you be happy to talk a bit more about some of the opportunities outside of the UK, particularly the US programs?
Of course. So one of the big differences in the US is your length of time will be a little bit longer to do your PhD, and later in this broadcast we'll be able to discuss that in more detail. But typically you'd apply to a university, and there'll be specific programs. They usually have a quite large cohort, so if you're applying to the molecular biology department at an Ivy League school, you might be joining with 20 other students. And that's different than joining even some of the programs in the UK would be quite a bit smaller. And you take courses for a couple of years, usually about a year and a half. And the reason behind that is in the US, their undergraduate is much more broad. And so it takes those first 2 years, that first year and a half, to really narrow down and actually get the depth of knowledge that a student coming from Cambridge would really already have. And I've always said, looking into the States, you really are great candidates from a Cambridge perspective because of the research experience you have, the skills you've learned, the writing skills, the presentation skills. So it is absolutely worth looking at it. The other big difference is, almost every program you will do rotations, and you'll do 3 or 4 rotations. So you have a chance to sample all the different parts of those departments. But yeah, it is noticeably different, but in any case, you're looking for what you're interested in and finding what works for you. And if it means something quicker and something with industry ties, for example, then you should absolutely go for it, no matter where it is.
Good. So in terms of finding PhDs, from the career service point of view, we would always encourage you to be really proactive. It's easy to browse findadphd.com and jobs.ac.uk to look for those advertised PhDs, but it is really important to be proactive and not just react to those advertised vacancies. So start early thinking about who you might want to work with and think about potential supervisors. Find out who's doing work in the field that you're interested in. You can use journals, look at institution websites because they all have research group pages, and do look at what the work that they're doing and whether that's something that you would be interested in. And it's always really beneficial to get in touch with the supervisor or someone in the research group that you'd like to work with. But it's really good to make this a very specific and targeted request to get in touch, to have those conversations. So be really specific about why you want to work with them and show you've done some research already and know what they do and why you're interested in working with them. So you might talk about some papers that you've read and why they were interesting to you, or refer to conversations that you've had with people in that particular research group already to highlight that you've done some legwork and you've got a real understanding of the work that they are doing. You're far more likely to get a response to a nicely crafted, targeted email than something generic that just says, I'm really interested in doing some research with you.
If you're sending a generic email, you're very unlikely to get a response. What I often recommend is something short, asking for something specific. So show them that you're interested. I read one of your papers. I thought the work on cell adhesion was really fascinating, and I'd love to chat with you. I'm interested in doing a PhD. Would a 10-minute Skype conversation be possible? Or attached as my CV, I'd be really interested in discussing a project more. I saw on your website that you have this project advertised. I'd really love to hear more about that and to ask a few questions. We don't need a page email explaining. We don't need a summary of the work that we've done previously. You really just want to get from an email then to some type of conversation, and that's the hurdle. Think about if you were receiving that same email you're sending. Would you feel obligated, or would you feel inspired? Would you be excited to reply to yourself? And that's usually a pretty good measure. If it's boring. If you're bored writing it, then we're probably bored reading it. That's what I like to think.
That's a really good advice. I think it's key, just to pick up on what Tim said there, that you can get into contact before applying for advertised PhDs too. And the real benefit of doing that is to figure out whether it's the right fit for you. You can read as much as you like online, but you'll never get that sort of rich information that will help you make that informed decision, whereas a conversation, a Skype call, talking to somebody else in that research group, not only is it useful for your application to show your interest and motivation, but it's helpful for you to make that informed decision so that you know that the choice you're making is the right one for you. So hopefully that gives you some good tips and advice for finding PhDs and understanding the different options that are out there and available. Thank you for watching part 1 of our video exploring PhDs and answering your questions. Once you've done a bit of research, if you've decided you'd like to apply for a PhD, check out part 2 in this series where we talk about what makes a great PhD candidate and how to make the most of your applications. Thank you for listening.